as established as the Clancy universe was, and as many writers that have gone there, I think there's probably been, Mark Graney was one of the first ones. Grant Blackwood, Mike Madden. There have been quite a few writers. Mark Cameron works in it right now. And so what you try and do is find like a little piece of ground that hasn't been tilled yet and say, hey, here's something nobody else has explored. And I want to try and work this and see if I can, plant a little crop here that grows up, that gives me something to do that still stays within the boundaries, but gives me the ability to do a fresh take on it. And so Target Acquired was the first book in the series that I wrote. And when I pitched the idea to Tom, when I sit down to write, I don't know how the story's going to end. I usually have just kind of a very broad idea of what I want to do. And as I'm writing, I'm telling the story to myself. And so when I pitched it to Tom, I said, hey, the problem with the Jack Ryan Jr. character, in my opinion, is that it's kind of like an Avengers movie, right? So unless you're Iron Man, because he's such an iconic actor and character, and he's the one that kicked off that franchise, if you're the Black Widow, you get overshadowed pretty quickly when everybody else is on stage, right? And so unless there's a spin-off Black Widow movie, you don't get to spend a lot of time in that character's head or get to know them better. And so in the Clancy universe, there were so many iconic characters like John Clark, who was, Rainbow Six, and Without Remorse is still, when you ask people, it's surprising because you would probably think it was Hunt for the Red October, but when you ask people their favorite Clancy book, most people say Without Remorse, which is John Clark's kind of origin story, and Ding Chavez and all. And so you have all these iconic characters. And what I didn't want is for them to overshadow Jack Ryan Jr., especially on my first entry or my first foray. And so what I pitched is like, let me write a really tight book that focuses only on Jack Ryan Jr., and to get to know, so I can get to know him better. And so as I was writing it, it occurred to me that he was about the same age as his father when the Tom Clancy books kicked off, Hunt for the Red October. He was in his mid-30s, except for his father at that point was married, had a family, was established in his career, had done these things. And Jack Ryan Jr. wasn't any of those things. And in fact, if you look at everybody else that surrounds him, they all, John Clark was a SEAL, was a Vietnam special activities group guy or a SOG guy. Ding Chavez was in the Army before. Mary Pat Foley was a case officer that ran the Cardinal of the Kremlin. And then there's this guy named Jack Ryan Jr., whose sole claim to fame is that his last name is Ryan, and that's it. He doesn't have any of the military experience, was never in the CIA. And so I started thinking about that, and I'm like, what would he have a chip on his shoulder? What would he do to try and prove that he belonged here? And so I fleshed that out a little more in Target Acquired, and also had Mark Cameron had done a thing where he had given Jack Ryan Jr. in his book a girlfriend, Lisanne Robertson, that he took home to mom and dad. And I thought, I want to explore that more too, because the guy's in his 30s. He's looking around and saying, is this the rest of my life? When my dad was this age, he had 2 kids. I love my mom and dad. I want something like that. And so that was kind of Target Acquired. My next book was 0 Hour, which took place primarily in Korea. And what I wanted to do with that one is say, okay, what does it look like if instead of being a singleton operator, Jack Ryan Jr. wants to prove that he has what it takes to be a team leader? And so how would that play out? He has a reputation for being very impulsive. How does he harness that? How does he prove to the other thing he's got going against him is that his boss is his dad's best friend, who they met together in Colombia in this crazy mission gone sideways. So how does he prove to John Clark he's willing and ready to be a team leader and he's one of the guys, and not just his best friend's son who is there because his last name's Ryan? And so that was 0 Hour. My next book that actually comes out in May 23rd is called Flashpoint. And so that takes things a step further, where Jack Ryan Jr. is now a team leader, and he has to deal with some of the things that make a team leader hard and make that job hard, and making hard calls and dealing with the consequences of those hard calls. And then my fourth book that I just finished, I turned into Tom last week, is called Weapons Grade, and that comes out in September. And in Weapons Grade, there's something in Flashpoint that really shakes Jack Ryan Jr. to the core. And so in Weapons Grade, he has to figure that out and say, how do I, this thing happened in Flashpoint. Does that define me now? Is that who I am? Is this really the job I still want? How do I deal with having a person that's very close to me who I'm also operational with? And so each one of those, all of them are tell hopefully a kick butt story that's meant to be compelling. But I think one of the ways you keep a series from being episodic is to explore the characters that way and their growth and say, hey, what can I flesh out that other writers haven't, that hopefully, again, going back to where we started, hopefully brings something the same but different to this series. So one of the things that makes it difficult writing in the Clancy universe is there's another writer whose book comes out 6 months before yours. And so for me, that's Mark Cameron. And so his book comes out in December, and then mine comes out in June. And oftentimes we're writing those books at the same time or trying to figure it out. And so he writes John Clark different than I would write John Clark. He writes Jack Ryan Sr. different than I did. And so what he and I kind of came together with is say, how do we deconflict this so that, and Mark, if you've never met him, was a former U.S. Marshal, manhunter, big bear of a man, lives in Alaska. So I was kind of like, Mr. Cameron, how would you like me to handle this? And we talked about it for a while. And he finally said, you write the young guys, I'll write the old guys. And that worked for a while until I wanted to tell a bigger story. And so Tom Clancy Flashpoint is really a Jack Ryan Sr. book because it has global stakes. You see what happens in the White House. But in order to do that, I needed a point of view character, and I knew I wasn't going to use Clark or the president. So I always, before I write another Clancy book, I always go back and read an old one that Tom wrote, one of the ones I love, to try and remember. When I first started writing the series, I literally got a blank piece of paper and said, what are cool stuff about Clancy books? And I just started making lists of things I love. So one of my favorite Clancy books is Cardinal of the Kremlin, that tells Mary Pat Foley's story. And so she's a mom with 2 young kids, but she's also a CIA officer, and she is running the Cardinal in the Kremlin. And I'm like, man, that's a fantastic character. And while she has certainly been in the other books, she doesn't often have a point of view role. And so I took her and used her in Flashpoint to be that connection to the White House, to kind of see how Jack Ryan Sr. was doing it. And I really spent a lot of time in her mind. I'm like, the only reason why she's here is because she is close friends with the president. She's of an age where she's probably ready to retire and hang out with the grandkids or her kids. But she's here because her oldest and dearest friend asked her to take this political job of which she has no aspirations to continue in politics. So what does she think about? Why? How does she walk that line between having one of her dearest friends also be the president? And how does that play out? And what does she try and shield him from? And so I got to do that a lot in Flashpoint, and I used her pretty extensively. In my other books, and in this one too, there's usually a conversation between Jack Ryan Jr. and Clark, but it's very much hey boss, here's the dumb thing I just did, and I got a plan to sort of fix it if you'll give me some rope to let me hang myself. With Mary Pat, it was much more interesting. And so when I went to write Weapons Grade, what I briefed Tom, my editor, is like, hey, I did this really big, sprawling book, takes place across the South China Sea and the Philippines and everything in Flashpoint. I want to do something smaller and tighter. I think my son goes to Texas A&M and I live in Austin. And so I drive through this little stretch of backcountry road in Texas. The speed limits are 70 miles an hour. The average population in these string of towns is maybe 5,000 people. And every single one of these towns has a Dairy Queen, a Pizza Hut, and a brand new bank. And I'm like, why do they have a brand new bank? What is going on in this town? And so I pitched Tom Colgan the idea. I'm like, hey, I'm going to write about this crazy thing. There had been this crime that happened in one of the towns where this kid was driving home from A&M and he went missing, and he's still missing. They found his car, they found his clothes in the side of the road. It was but they had never found him, and they have no idea what happened to him. And it gave me an idea for something. And I was like, what if I write this small town, Jack Ryan's going to see an Aggie game and he's coming back and this thing happens. And so my editor's like, kind of like a Jack Reacher. I'm like, yeah, like a Jack Reacher. And he's like, that's a great idea. Write that. And so he goes off and starts working on the cover and the titles for the book. And so I'm working as I do. And then he sends me, maybe a month before the book's due, here's some titles I'm thinking about. Here's the cover for the book. And this is where I tell him, I was like, that small town thing I was talking about? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, what actually happens is Iran is about to reach breakout on a nuclear reactor. And there's this hypersonic plane that has this. And to his credit, he just responded with, I'll send you a new cover. It sounds cool. And so because of that, though, I ended up bringing Mary Pat back again because I needed this story. It ended up becoming another Jack Ryan Sr. book instead of a Jack Ryan Jr. book. And so it's really fun to do that. But I'm also very, very careful that I'm not trying to write the same characters Mark is, because I don't want the reader to get whiplash because it's the same readers that buy all of these books. And I don't want them to read his book and then go to mine and find out, despite my best intentions, that I portray John Clark differently than he does. But it's been really fun. I try and put Easter eggs in there and throwbacks to old Clancy books and things that have happened because I'm such a fan, and because I deliberately read one of the legacy Clancy books before I go to write my new one. Writing Jack Ryan Sr. is crazy because he is, like you said, you call him the king. He's the one that all of this universe revolves around. And so, to be clear, I haven't written from his point of view. I use Mary Pat or something to be in the room with him, but it's a really hard balance to walk because as a reader and a fan, I look at him as Superman, but that doesn't make a super compelling character, right? Because he has to do things wrong. He has to have flaws. He has to be human. And so it's his scenes, or the scenes that he's in it, are some of the hardest ones to write. Also because I'm very, very conscientious about wanting to portray him the way that Mark Cameron portrays him or close to that. But it's pretty amazing. When I think this many, I don't know how many books total there are in the Clancy universe, maybe upwards of 20 or something. And what I try and do, especially because I'm new and I feel a lot of the just pinch me stuff, is to throw stuff in for some of the readers, like I said before, who maybe never read those legacy books and don't realize everything Jack Ryan. And so I'll find ways, like as an aside, to say, and then this is bad, but it's not as bad as the time he dropped into the water trying to board he boarded a Russian submarine with nothing but a pistol or something like that. And so it is pretty incredible. And it's just, I just think it's amazing that we're able to keep that character alive and that universe alive. I think that's the best part.